They thought she was just another old woman. Helpless, frail, easy to break. For weeks, they roamed the town like they owned it, terrorizing shopkeepers, taking what they wanted, daring anyone to stop them. No one did. No one could, until they made one fatal mistake. They pushed Margaret Beaumont, an 86-year-old woman, alone, unarmed, just an easy target to them. But Margaret wasn't just any old woman. She was a soldier, a fighter, a woman trained in war, forged in battle, and built to never break. And when they tried to take everything from her, she made one phone call. By the time they realized who they were dealing with, it was too late. This is the story of how a woman they underestimated brought an entire gang to its knees. And you won't believe how it ends. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us where in the world you're watching from. If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, cause tomorrow's story is going to be mind-blowing. Margaret Beaumont had lived in the same town for more than 50 years, watching the world change around her in slow, inevitable ways. She had once been a young woman with sharp eyes and a sharper mind, standing at the front lines of history itself, but time had a way of dulling even the strongest steel. Now, at 86 years old, she was just another elderly resident of a town that had nearly forgotten its past. Nestled in a quiet valley surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests, her town had always been a peaceful place, the kind where folks left their doors unlocked and neighbors exchanged baked goods over white picket fences. It wasn't a place where crime thrived, nor was it a town that saw much trouble. The biggest drama usually involved someone's grandkid getting caught shoplifting a candy bar from the corner store, or the occasional dispute over who had the best garden display at the summer fair. It was a town that moved at a slower pace, where people still sat on their porches in the evenings, sipping iced tea and watching the sun sink into the horizon. Margaret had built her life here after her years of service. She had been in the military, and not just in a behind-the-desk role like many assume when they looked at her now. She had seen combat, trained soldiers, and held her own in situations where survival wasn't guaranteed. She had been a fighter. But that was a long time ago, and now she was just an old woman in the eyes of the world. Not that she minded. She had long since embraced the quiet rhythm of her later years. Her days were predictable, early mornings spent tending to her small garden, afternoons dedicated to reading on her porch, and evenings filled with the comforting hum of the old radio in her kitchen. She lived alone now, her husband having passed away a decade prior, and her children grown and scattered across the country, living busy lives of their own. Margaret never complained. She was independent, self-sufficient, and stubborn to the bone. Age had slowed her body, but it had not broken her spirit. But peace is a fragile thing, and Margaret's quiet life came under threat the moment the bikers arrived. It started with a sound, one she hadn't heard in town before. The distant rumble of engines. At first, she thought it was nothing more than a few motorcyclists passing through, maybe some out-of-towners enjoying a road trip. But then the noise didn't stop. The engines kept roaring, growing louder day by day, until they became an almost constant presence. And soon, the bikers weren't just passing through. They were settling in. Margaret saw them for the first time from her porch, sitting in her old rocking chair with a cup of coffee in her hands. A dozen men on heavy motorcycles, clad in black leather, patches sewn into their jackets like battle scars. Their presence wasn't just noticeable, it was overwhelming. They rode into town like they owned it, parking their bikes outside the diner, the gas station, the grocery store. They laughed loudly, moved in groups, and carried with them an air of defiance that unsettled the townsfolk. Margaret had seen their kind before, not these exact men, but men like them. She had seen them in war zones, in the underbellies of cities where authority had no real power. She recognized the way they carried themselves. They weren't here just to pass through. They were here to take over. At first, the town did what small towns often do in the face of trouble. They ignored it. They pretended it wasn't happening, hoping the newcomers would get bored and move on. But Margaret wasn't naive. She knew trouble when she saw it. The first real sign of danger came when the bikers started claiming territory. They lingered outside shops for hours, making crude comments toward the locals, especially the elderly. One afternoon, Margaret watched from her usual seat at the diner as the group blocked the entrance, laughing at the nervous cashier who was too afraid to ask them to move. They didn't buy anything, didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to make people uncomfortable. They wanted control, and fear was their currency. Margaret didn't scare easily, but she wasn't a fool either. She knew that men like this fed off intimidation, and the more people cowered, the more power they gained. She told herself it wasn't her fight. She was old. She had already fought her battles, and now she just wanted peace. But that peace was already slipping through her fingers. And then they noticed her. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, the sun high in the sky, when Margaret was leaving the grocery store with a small bag of vegetables and a carton of milk. She moved slower these days, her cane tapping against the pavement as she stepped out onto the sidewalk. That's when she heard it, a whistle. Sharp, mocking. She didn't turn immediately, but she didn't need to. She could feel their eyes on her, could hear the low chuckles of men who thought they were untouchable. "Hey, Grandma," one of them called. His voice was thick with amusement, laced with something uglier underneath. "Need a hand with that? Might be too heavy for you." Margaret exhaled slowly. She had been through worse. She had stood face to face with enemies on battlefields, had endured days of exhaustion and hunger that these men couldn't even begin to imagine. She wasn't about to let a pack of leather-clad hooligans shake her. So she straightened her back, adjusted her grip on her cane, and turned to face them. Her eyes met the leader's, a man in his 40s, bearded, with cold, calculating eyes. The kind of man who had built his power by taking advantage of the weak. He smirked when he saw her looking. She didn't blink. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady. The smirk faltered just for a second. It was clear he wasn't used to defiance, especially not from an old woman. The others laughed, muttering to each other, but Margaret didn't stick around to listen. She turned and walked away, her steps slow but unwavering. But that was only the beginning. From that day on, she was on their radar. They made a game out of testing her patience, revving their engines outside her house late at night, blocking her usual seat at the diner, calling her Grandma Soldier in mocking tones. It was small at first, little things meant to wear her down, to remind her that she was powerless against them. But Margaret wasn't powerless. She just wasn't ready to fight back yet. Because soon, the harassment wouldn't just be words. Soon, it would escalate. And when it did, Margaret would be forced to make a decision that would change everything. For most of its history, Fairwood had been a town untouched by time. It was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked at night, where shopkeepers knew their customers by name, and where life moved at a comfortable, familiar pace. Nothing ever truly changed here, at least not until they came. It started with a whisper, a slow but unsettling shift in air, like the feeling of an approaching storm long before the first raindrop fell. It was a Monday morning when Margaret first heard the sound that would change everything, the distant, guttural rumble of engines. She had been sitting on her porch, sipping her usual black coffee, the warmth of the mug seeping into her frail but steady hands. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting golden light over the tree-lined streets, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to sink into the peace of the morning. But then the sound grew louder. She lifted her head, her sharp blue eyes narrowing as she spotted the first group of bikers rolling through town like an invading army. 4 men on massive motorcycles, their bodies clad in thick black leather, their faces hidden behind dark sunglasses. The patches on their jackets were foreign to her, embroidered insignias that told a story only those who lived in their world could read. They didn't stop. They didn't slow down. They just rode through. Margaret watched as they passed her house, the deep growl of their engines shaking the quiet of the morning. Even after they disappeared down the main road, their presence lingered like the fading echo of something ominous. She had seen their kind before. Not these exact men, but men like them. Predators. Opportunists. The kind that came into places where people were comfortable, where life was easy and unsuspecting. And they were never just passing through. By Friday, there were more. They arrived in waves, small groups of 2 or 3, sometimes 5. The town barely had time to recover from one sighting before another batch arrived. The motel on the outskirts of town, which had always been half empty, was now fully occupied. The diner, usually filled with the soft murmur of conversation, was now host to the loud, crude laughter of men who didn't belong. People whispered. They watched but said nothing. And then the town's routine began to shift. The first real sign of trouble came at Murphy's gas station. Murphy's had been in town for as long as Margaret had, run by Mr. Thompson, a kind man in his 70s who had once served as the town's mayor before retiring to a quieter life. He still insisted on personally greeting every customer, even pumping gas for the elderly. But one evening, that changed. It was just after sunset, the streetlights flickering to life as the sky melted into hues of deep purple. Margaret was in her living room, flipping through the pages of an old book when she heard the commotion outside. Then the shouting started. And she knew. By the time she made her way to the gas station, a small crowd had gathered, whispering amongst themselves as they watched from a cautious distance. Margaret pushed past them, cane tapping against the pavement as she got close enough to see. Mr. Thompson was pinned against the glass window of his own store, his frail body held in place by the grip of a man nearly twice his size. The biker was laughing. His grip was casual, his fingers curled into the fabric of Mr. Thompson's shirt as if testing how much force it would take to tear it. "I don't think you understand, old man," the biker said, his voice dripping with amusement. "I asked you a question." "I told you," Mr. Thompson rasped, his face pale with barely contained fear. "You can't just stand around here all day harassing customers." The biker chuckled. He loosened his grip just enough for the old man to stumble forward, only to shove him back against the glass with a bone-rattling thud. The crowd gasped. No one moved. No one stopped it. Margaret's hands curled into fists. She wanted to step forward to say something, do something. But before she could act, the biker finally released his grip and stepped back, grinning as if the whole thing had been a game. Then he turned, and that's when he saw her. Margaret didn't look away. She held his gaze, unflinching, steady. The biker tilted his head, smirking. And just like that, she was on their radar. From that night on, the town changed. People stopped going out after dark. Shops closed earlier than usual. The sidewalks, once lively with evening strolls and small talk, became eerily empty. Nobody wanted to be outside when the bikers were around. And the worst part, they knew it. They knew the town was afraid, and they fed off it. It started small, bikes revving their engines just outside people's homes in the dead of night, waking families from their sleep. Then came the loitering, groups of them standing outside businesses, saying nothing, just watching. Then the vandalism started. Margaret saw it happen from her porch. The diner's windows were smashed. Someone spray-painted obscenities across the town hall. Street signs were bent out of shape, ripped straight from the ground as if some invisible storm had passed through. But the police did nothing. And Margaret knew why. The bikers outnumbered them. Fairwood only had 2 officers, neither of whom had ever dealt with anything worse than a drunken bar fight. They had no experience, no backup, and no idea how to handle what was happening. And that's when the fear turned into silence. Nobody spoke up. Nobody reported the crimes. Because deep down, they all knew the truth. This wasn't just a passing storm. This was a takeover. Margaret sat in her living room that night, staring at the old rotary phone on the table beside her. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. She had been through war before. She had seen what happened when good people did nothing. And she knew one thing with certainty. If someone didn't push back, this town will belong to the bikers forever. She just hadn't decided yet whether that person was going to be her. But soon she wouldn't have a choice, because soon they were going to come for her. Margaret Beaumont had always believed in patience. It was something she had learned in the military, something drilled into her through years of training. Patience could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. It allowed her to assess situations before acting, to measure threats before confronting them. But as the days passed and the bikers became more brazen, she began to realize something. This wasn't just a test of patience. This was a test of will. Fairwood had changed. The town that had once been a sanctuary of quiet, where children rode their bikes down Main Street without a care in the world, was now drowning in an air of unease. The sidewalks were empty long before sunset, and businesses closed earlier and earlier, as if the owners had collectively agreed that it was better to lose a few hours of income than to risk trouble. The streets no longer felt safe. And it wasn't just fear that Margaret saw in people's eyes. It was defeat. She had lived long enough to recognize that particular look, that telltale slump in a person's shoulders, the way they avoided eye contact when the bikers passed. It was the look of people who had already surrendered. Margaret hated that look. She had seen it before, on the faces of civilians in war zones, in the expressions of soldiers who had given up before the battle was over. And now she saw it in her neighbors, the same people who used to greet her with warm smiles at the post office, the same people who used to wave to her from their porches. She knew she was supposed to accept it, to let it go. She was an old woman now. This wasn't her fight. But the problem was, Margaret had never known how to back down from a fight. It started small, as these things often did. The first time the bikers made their presence known to her directly, she had been at the grocery store, browsing through the limited selection of fresh produce. She had just reached for a carton of eggs when she heard the chuckle. "Damn, they still let relics like you out on your own." The voice was casual, amused, but laced with something else. Margaret didn't turn right away. She didn't need to. She had heard that tone before, from men who thought they were untouchable, from soldiers who had underestimated her on the training grounds. Slowly, she placed the eggs in her basket and straightened. Then she turned. There were two of them. One was in his late 30s, thick-necked and broad-shouldered, his beard peppered with gray. The other was younger, lanky but wiry, with dark ink covering his arms and crawling up his neck. Both wore the same leather jackets, the same smug expressions. Margaret met the older one's gaze. "Something I can help you with?" she asked, her voice even. The man smirked, nudging his companion. "Feisty one, huh?" The younger man laughed. "Bet she was a real piece of work back in the day." Margaret let out a slow breath, forcing herself to remain still, to stay calm. "Seems to me you boys are in the wrong section," she said, nodding toward their empty hands. "Unless they started selling cheap beer next to the vegetables." For a split second, the younger one blinked, caught off guard by the directness of her words. Then the older one let out a slow, deliberate chuckle, a sound that wasn't quite friendly. "You got a mouth on you, Grandma." Margaret adjusted her grip on her cane. "And you got 5 seconds to get out of my way before I test how hard I can swing this." Silence. The younger one grinned, shaking his head in disbelief. "Man, I like her." But the older one, he just stared at her. And in that stare, Margaret saw something shift. It wasn't anger, not yet, but it was awareness. A realization that she wasn't afraid. And that meant she was a problem. They left her alone that day. But they didn't forget. The next time, they made sure she knew it. The first real confrontation happened at Frank's Diner. Margaret had been going there for years. It was a place of comfort, a small but welcoming spot where she could sit with a hot cup of coffee and enjoy the quiet hum of conversation around her. But when she arrived that evening, the atmosphere was different. She saw them before she even stepped inside. 3 of them this time, leaning against their motorcycles parked directly outside the entrance. Their presence was deliberate. They weren't blocking the doorway, not exactly, but they might as well have been. They stood in that casual, calculated way that Margaret had seen before, in places where men tried to establish dominance through presence alone. Margaret didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her cane tapping against the pavement as she approached. One of them, the bearded one from the grocery store, grinned when he saw her. Well, well, look who's still kicking. Margaret didn't stop. Move. The younger one smirked. What's the rush, Grandma Soldier? She didn't ask how they knew. She had suspected they had looked into her. The way they watched her now wasn't just with amusement, it was with calculation. She stepped forward again. This time, the younger one moved directly into her path. Come on, we're just having a little fun, he said. No need to be rude. Margaret stared at him. Then, without hesitation, she lifted her cane and swung. It wasn't a heavy strike, not enough to injure, but enough to make a point. The cane smacked against his shin with a sharp crack. The man stumbled back, cursing. The bearded one let out a sharp bark of laughter, shaking his head. Man, you really don't back down, do you? Margaret didn't answer. She just stepped around them and pushed open the diner door. But as she walked inside, she knew. This wasn't over. She had drawn a line in the sand. And men like them, they never let that go unanswered. Margaret had known this was coming. She had seen it in the way the bikers watched her, in the barely contained amusement that flickered behind their eyes whenever she defied them. She had felt it in the subtle shifts of their behavior, how their laughter had turned colder, how their presence had grown heavier, how their words, once coated in mocking playfulness, had begun to carry a sharper edge. They weren't used to being challenged. And men like them, they didn't let defiance go unanswered. She woke up to the first real warning 3 days after the incident at Frank's Diner. It was early, just before dawn, when she heard the rumble of engines outside her house. The deep guttural growl of motorcycles shattered the quiet of the morning, a deliberate intrusion meant to shake her from sleep. But Margaret had always been a light sleeper. Long before her age had made rest a fickle thing, her training had conditioned her to wake at the first sign of disturbance. She sat up in bed, heart steady, listening. The engines revved, the sound reverberating through the walls, rattling the windows. It lasted for exactly 1 minute. And then silence. Margaret exhaled slowly. She didn't move right away. She had spent too many years preparing for moments like this to act on impulse. Instead, she listened. Waited. When nothing followed, she pushed herself up, ignoring the stiffness in her joints, and walked to the window. The street was empty. But when she stepped outside an hour later, she found her porch covered in cigarette butts, crushed beer cans, and shattered glass. A message. Not an attack, not yet, but a promise. Margaret stared at the mess for a long moment. Then, without a word, she grabbed a broom and cleaned it up. Because that's what they wanted. A reaction. And Margaret never gave the enemy what they wanted. But if the bikers had been hoping to rattle her, to shake her foundation, to make her feel small, they didn't know who they were dealing with. That night she sat in her chair by the window, the old rotary phone beside her, the same phone she had used for years. The town had long since switched to mobile phones and modern conveniences, but Margaret had never been one to follow the times. She had never needed to. Because when she needed to reach someone, she didn't waste time scrolling through contacts. She knew exactly who to call. The next act of intimidation came sooner than she expected. It was just past noon when Margaret decided to take a walk. She had spent the morning tending to her garden, the rhythmic act of pulling weeds and trimming hedges helping to keep her mind clear. The tension in town had grown thick, hanging over everything like a storm waiting to break. People were afraid. She could see it in the way they spoke in hushed voices, in the way their eyes darted toward the streets, expecting trouble. Margaret refused to live like that. So she did what she had always done. She carried on. She walked down the street toward the small market, ignoring the whispers of her neighbors as she passed. They knew what had happened outside her house. Everyone did, but no one said a word. They were waiting to see what she would do. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of fear. But when she reached the market, she realized the bikers had escalated. There were 6 of them this time, gathered outside, their bikes lined up like a blockade. They weren't talking, weren't joking amongst themselves. They were waiting. And when they saw her, their expressions shifted. She could see it in the way they straightened, in the way their smirks grew sharper. The bearded one, the leader, the one who had spoken to her at the diner, stepped forward, his boots scuffing against the pavement. "Morning, Grandma." Margaret didn't stop walking. "Move." He chuckled. "See, that's the thing. We were just about to head inside, but now that you're here," he tilted his head, "maybe we should all go in together." Margaret met his gaze, unwavering. "No." For a moment, there was silence. Then the younger one, the one she had struck with her cane, smirked. "She's got balls, I'll give her that." Margaret exhaled slowly, calculated, measured, controlled. She had faced worse men than them. She had stood in places where fear was a luxury, where hesitation got people killed. She had walked through hell and come out the other side. And she refused to let a pack of bikers intimidate her. She took a step forward. For the first time, the leader hesitated. Just for a second. Margaret saw it, the flicker of doubt, the momentary break in his confidence. He had expected her to back down. They all had. But Margaret never backed down. And then it happened. A loud crash. Margaret didn't flinch. But the bikers turned. From the alleyway beside the market, a figure stepped forward. Not one of them, but someone else. Someone Margaret recognized. And that's when she knew. The call she had made the night before had been answered. The town had underestimated Margaret. The bikers had underestimated her. That was their mistake. Because Margaret had never been alone. She had spent her life forming alliances, building relationships with people who didn't just fade away. People who remembered debts. People who didn't take kindly to threats against their own. And now the bikers were about to find out exactly who they had been messing with. The war had begun. And Margaret, she was ready. Margaret Beaumont had spent her life mastering the art of reading the battlefield. The battlefield didn't always mean trenches and gunfire. Sometimes it was the small things, a shift in posture, a flicker of doubt in an enemy's eyes, the way a threat carried itself. The war had changed locations over the years, but Margaret had never stopped being a soldier. And now, as she sat on her porch, cane resting across her lap, she could see a different kind of battle unfolding in Fairwood. It was in the way people walked faster through town, in how shopkeepers avoided confrontation, in the fact that no one dared look the bikers in the eyes anymore. Fear was settling in, and she hated it. Margaret took a slow breath, staring out at the quiet street. She had spent decades fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves, standing up when others cowered. But now, her town was cowering. She could feel the frustration burning in her chest. She had fought too hard for this town to hand it over to some thugs in leather jackets. Her grip tightened around her cane. Enough was enough. She picked up the old rotary phone in her kitchen. The town had moved on to modern conveniences, but Margaret had never trusted cell phones. She had never seen the need for them. When she wanted to reach someone, she knew exactly where to find them. And right now, she knew exactly who she needed. Her hands were steady as she dialed the number. A number she hadn't called in over 20 years. It rang once, twice, then a voice, gravelly, familiar. One she never thought she'd hear again. "Didn't think I'd be hearing from you, Ironheart." Margaret's lips twitched. "You always said I was too stubborn to die quietly." A chuckle. "That I did. What's going on?" Margaret glanced toward the window, her sharp eyes catching a motorcycle rolling slowly past her house. They were watching, waiting. "I've got a problem," she said. A pause. "Then, what kind of problem?" "The kind that doesn't know what it's gotten itself into." Another pause. Then a slow, knowing exhale. You need backup. Margaret's fingers curled around the edge of the table. She hated asking for help, but she also knew when she needed it. I need Red. Silence. Then a low, approving chuckle. You're serious? I wouldn't be calling if I wasn't. Then a single, decisive response. I'll send him. Click. The line went dead. Margaret exhaled slowly, setting the phone back in place. The bikers thought they were dealing with an old woman. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The next morning, Margaret sat on her porch as usual, sipping her coffee. She was waiting. She had spent decades perfecting patience, knowing that the right moment was more valuable than any hasty action. And right now, she knew exactly what moment was coming. The bikers were out. A few of them loitered outside the market, the same place they had tried to corner her before. Others were scattered along Main Street, acting as if they owned the town. Margaret had seen this before. She had seen men like this before, and she had crushed them before. Then she heard it. A single motorcycle. Not a group. Not a gang. Just one. And Margaret smiled, because she knew one was all she needed. The motorcycle rolled to a slow stop in front of the market, its engine purring like a predator stalking its prey. And then he stepped off. James Red Holloway, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, moving with the effortless precision of a man who had spent his entire life fighting battles most people never even knew existed. His hair was streaked with gray now, his leather jacket worn with age, but nothing about him had softened. Margaret watched as the bikers immediately took notice. They didn't recognize him. Not yet, but they felt the shift. Predators knew when another predator entered the territory. And Red? He wasn't here to make friends. He pulled off his helmet, shaking out the remnants of his once fiery red hair, and turned toward Margaret with a grin. Well, I'll be damned, he drawled. You still alive? Margaret snorted. Not for lack of trying. Red chuckled, stepping onto the porch, giving her a long, assessing look. You look good, he said. Margaret rolled her eyes. I look old. Red smirked. Same thing. One of the younger bikers, a cocky, overconfident fool, stepped forward. Hey, he called out. You lost, old man? Red didn't even glance at him. Margaret did, and the look she gave was enough to make the younger biker hesitate. Then the bearded leader stepped forward. The same man who had been testing Margaret for weeks. He looked Red up and down, eyes narrowing. You from around here? Red smirked. Used to be. The leader crossed his arms. This is our town now. Red chuckled. Yeah. He tilted his head slightly. Funny thing about towns, they don't belong to anyone who can't hold on to them. Silence. Tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, Red reached into his pocket. The bikers tensed. Their hands twitched toward their weapons. But Red didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a military challenge coin and dropped it at the bearded leader's feet. The small clink it made against the pavement might as well have been a gunshot, because every single biker went still. They knew. They recognized what it meant. Challenge coins weren't just collectibles. They were proof. Proof of brotherhood. Proof of service. Proof that the man standing in front of them was not someone to mess with. Margaret took a slow step forward. You boys have been playing at being in charge, she said, her voice quiet, deadly. But I think it's time someone reminded you what real authority looks like. The leader's fists clenched. Red? He just smiled. Now, Red said, why don't you boys tell me where you got the idea that bullying an old war vet was a good idea? Silence. Then the leader turned, spitting onto the ground. This ain't over, he muttered. Margaret smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. The bikers left. For now. But Margaret knew this was only the beginning. She turned to Red, her eyes sharp. You ready for a war? Red smirked. Aren't we always? Margaret lifted her chin, her eyes locked on the road. If they wanted a fight, she'd give them one. Margaret knew better than to put her faith in people who didn't understand war. She had spent her life dealing with those who preferred to look the other way, those who convinced themselves that if they ignored a problem long enough, it would simply disappear. She had seen weak men hide behind bureaucracy, refusing to act when action was needed most. And now she was watching it happen all over again. Fairwood had a sheriff. Technically, Sheriff Douglas Wright had been elected more than a decade ago, a man who had built his career on not making waves. He was the type who handed out parking tickets and settled petty disputes between neighbors, the type who took pride in the fact that Fairwood had never needed real law enforcement. And Margaret knew exactly what kind of man he was, because men like Wright never stood their ground when it counted. Still, she had to try, because if the law wasn't willing to act, then she'd be forced to handle things her way. And that was the last thing Fairwood wanted. She walked into the sheriff's office just after noon, her cane tapping against the wooden floor. The small single-room building was as underwhelming as she remembered. An old wooden desk cluttered with paperwork, a half-empty coffee cup sitting next to an untouched plate of stale donuts. There was a single holding cell in the back, barely big enough to fit a man of average size, and a radio that crackled with faint static, though nobody seemed to be listening. Sheriff Wright looked up from behind his desk, his mustache twitching in mild surprise. "Well, I'll be," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Margaret Beaumont. Haven't seen you in here in a long time." Margaret didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We need to talk." Wright exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. He looked tired. Not in the way a man who worked too hard did, but in the way a man who was constantly avoiding responsibility looked. "Margaret," he said, sighing, "I already know why you're here." She lifted an eyebrow. "Then you know what needs to be done." Wright hesitated. That was all the answer she needed. Margaret hated hesitation. It was the one thing a leader couldn't afford. When men hesitated, people died. Wright leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Look, I understand you're upset. Hell, I don't like those bikers being here any more than you do. But," he spread his hands, "what do you expect me to do?" Margaret's jaw tightened. She had seen countless men like this. Men who weren't bad, not exactly, but who lacked the spine to do what needed to be done. "Do your job," she said. Wright sighed again, shaking his head. "Margaret, I've got a force of 2 deputies. That's it. 2 young kids who barely know how to handle a speeding ticket, let alone a criminal gang. So train them," Margaret said flatly. Wright let out a humorless chuckle. "Train them? To do what exactly?" "March down Main Street and arrest a dozen bikers." Margaret didn't blink. "Yes." The sheriff ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Margaret, these guys, they're not just some out-of-town drifters. They're organized. Hell, I wouldn't be surprised if they had connections to some very bad people outside of Fairwood." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "So?" Wright blinked. "So?" "Margaret, you don't get it. If I push too hard, we could be drawing attention we don't want." Margaret let out a slow breath, and then she laughed. A short, sharp sound, not of humor, of pure disbelief. "You think ignoring them is going to keep Fairwood safe?" she asked. Wright frowned. "I think picking fights with the wrong people is going to get someone hurt." Margaret leaned forward, resting both hands on her cane. "People are already getting hurt." Wright didn't respond. Margaret could see it in his face. He knew, but knowing wasn't enough. She studied him for a moment, searching for something, anything that told her this man could be convinced to do the right thing. But all she saw was fear. Not fear of the bikers. Fear of making a mistake. And that was worse. She exhaled slowly, straightening. "Cowards don't keep towns safe, Douglas," she said. Wright flinched. Margaret turned and walked toward the door. But before she could leave, he called after her. Margaret, wait. She stopped. A long pause. Then, don't do anything stupid. Margaret smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Oh, Douglas, she murmured. I stopped being stupid a long time ago. And with that, she walked out. Because Margaret didn't ask for permission. She had given him a chance to act. And now she was done waiting. The town's silence. Margaret knew the sheriff wouldn't help. But she had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that at least someone in town would be willing to fight for what was right. She was wrong. Over the next 2 days, she spoke to dozens of people. Business owners, churchgoers, even a few of the younger men who had once been so eager to talk about defending their town. They all said the same thing. We don't want trouble. We just need to wait it out. Maybe they'll leave on their own. They won't. Margaret knew that better than anyone. Bullies didn't just leave. They had to be removed. By force, if necessary. And if Fairwood wasn't willing to fight, then she would. Alone, if she had to. That night, Margaret sat on her porch, the weight of exhaustion settling into her bones. She wasn't tired from walking. She wasn't even tired from arguing with people who refused to listen. She was tired of waiting for someone else to do the right thing. A familiar rumble in the distance caught her attention. Motorcycles. She didn't move as they approached, her face unreadable as 3 bikes rolled to a stop directly in front of her house. The bearded leader stepped off first, his boots crunching against the gravel. He didn't speak right away. Then, after a long pause, "You should have stayed quiet." Margaret smiled. "I was never very good at that." The leader's jaw tightened. "This is your last chance. Stop pushing, or things get ugly." Margaret's eyes gleamed. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, standing to her full height. She leaned forward, lowering her voice into something cold, cutting. "I'm counting on it." The leader hesitated. Just for a second. Then he turned and left. Margaret watched him go. Then she exhaled, stretching out her stiff fingers. They had made their final mistake. Because Margaret wasn't alone anymore. Red was here, and war was coming. Margaret had spent her life preparing for war. She had fought in foreign lands, had watched men rise and fall, had seen battles won and lost. But now the battlefield wasn't across the ocean. It was right here, and it was only a matter of time before the enemy struck first. She had given them every chance to back down. She had warned them. She had shown them who she was, what she was capable of. But bullies never backed down. They escalated. And that was exactly what they did. It happened just past midnight. Margaret had been awake, sitting in her old leather chair near the window, watching the world outside with the patience of a predator. She had learned long ago that attacks came in the dead of night, when people were vulnerable, when they least expected it. But Margaret was always expecting it. And she was ready. The first sign was the sound of boots on gravel. Then the creak of the wooden fence swinging open. Margaret didn't move. Not yet. Instead, she listened. Counted the footsteps. 3. No 4. 4 men. She heard the faint scrape of metal against metal, lockpicks. They were trying to be quiet. Trying to be careful. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Margaret exhaled slowly, rising from her chair. Her joints ached, her muscles stiff from years of use, but she moved with a purpose. She reached for the Louisville slugger bat propped against the wall. Not a gun. Not yet. She wanted them to feel this. To feel what it was like to underestimate the wrong person. The lock clicked open. The door creaked. Margaret moved before they did. Fast, precise, brutal. She swung the bat, hard. The first man never saw it coming. The crack of wood against bone was loud, sickeningly satisfying. The intruder let out a choked scream as he stumbled back, his hand flying to his ribs. Margaret didn't stop. She turned the bat, swinging upward, connecting with his jaw. He hit the ground hard. The second lunge for her. Margaret was already moving. She stepped aside at the last second, using his own momentum against him. The third grabbed her arm. She drove her elbow into his throat. His grip loosened. She grabbed his wrist, twisting hard, and felt the snap of bone beneath her fingers. The fourth didn't move. He stood there, eyes wide, frozen. Margaret smiled. "Tell your boss," she said, her voice calm, cold, lethal, "that the next time he sends men to my house, I won't be so kind." The fourth man swallowed hard. Then he ran. Margaret stood over the others, breathing heavily, her grip tightening around the bat. She wanted them to understand. She was not afraid of them. And now they had no idea what to do with her. Margaret didn't call the police. She didn't need to. Sheriff Wright wouldn't do anything. The town wouldn't do anything. This was her fight, and she was going to end it her way. By morning, the whole town knew. Word traveled fast in places like Fairwood. By the time Margaret made her way to the market, people were whispering. "I heard she took down 4 of them. Broke a guy's ribs. They tried to kill her. She's gonna get herself killed." Margaret ignored them all. Because now, she wasn't fighting alone. She stepped inside the market, grabbed her usual carton of milk, and walked toward the counter. Red was already there, waiting. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her. Then he smirked. "So," he drawled, "you finally decided to stop playing nice?" Margaret shrugged. "I gave them a chance." Red chuckled. "Yeah, I'm sure they appreciate that." Margaret handed the cashier her money, then turned to Red. "They're going to hit back harder," she said. Red nodded. "Yeah, they are. Plus, then you ready?" Margaret exhaled slowly. She thought about the town. She thought about the bikers. She thought about the war that was coming. And then she smiled. "I was born ready." That night, Margaret didn't wait for the bikers to come to her. She went to them. Red was at her side as they walked down Main Street, moving with purpose, with absolute confidence. They weren't hiding. They weren't afraid. They were going to send a message. The bar where the bikers gathered was loud, filled with laughter, with the scent of beer and sweat. But as soon as Margaret and Red walked in, the noise died. The bearded leader was there. He turned slowly, his smirk already forming. Margaret met his gaze, and then she tossed something onto the table. The bearded leader looked down, and his smirk vanished, because there, sitting between them, was the brass knuckles she had taken off one of his men the night before. A warning, a declaration. Margaret leaned forward, voice quiet but deadly. "I don't care how many of you there are," she said. "I don't care what you think you've done. You've already lost." The leader clenched his jaw. Margaret smiled. "Now get out of my town." The bikers weren't going to back down. Not yet. Margaret knew it. Red knew it. But the difference now, the bikers knew that they were no longer in control. And that terrified them. The bearded leader stood slowly, his eyes locked on Margaret. "This isn't over." Margaret tilted her head. "Oh, honey," she murmured. "It never even started." She turned on her heel and walked out. Red followed, laughing under his breath. "They're going to retaliate," he said. Margaret nodded. "I'm counting on it, because now it was time to finish this, once and for all." Margaret sat in her dimly lit kitchen, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the wall, its hands creeping toward midnight as she ran a slow, steady finger over the rotary phone's dial, her mind working through every possible outcome of what was to come. The bikers had made their move, and she had answered, but this wasn't over, not by a long shot. If anything, it had only just begun. She had spent her entire life studying how men like them operated, how bullies escalated when they were forced into a corner, how fear made them reckless, and how power made them desperate. The next strike would be bigger, more vicious, more dangerous, and she knew, without a shred of doubt, that it would come soon. She had given the town a chance to stand beside her, had walked through Fairwood's streets and looked its people in the eyes, searching for anyone who still had the fire to fight for what was theirs. But all she had found was fear. They wanted to believe the storm would pass, that if they kept their heads down and their mouths shut, the bikers would eventually get bored and move on. But Margaret knew better. Predators didn't leave their prey alone just because it stopped struggling. They sank their teeth in deeper, tore off more, took until there was nothing left. The only way to stop them was to remind them what it felt like to bleed. Her fingers hovered over the dial, and she inhaled deeply, knowing that the call she was about to make would change everything. She had always sworn she would never use this number, never cash in the favor she was owed unless it was absolutely necessary, but the time had come, and she was done waiting for someone else to do the right thing. She pressed the first digit, then the second, her movements slow but deliberate as she completed the sequence. The phone rang once, twice, then a third time before a deep, gravelly voice answered, one she hadn't heard in nearly 2 decades but still recognized instantly. "You really waited this long to call in that favor?" Margaret exhaled, a slow, measured breath that did nothing to ease the weight in her chest. "Figured I'd save it for something worth using it on." The man on the other end let out a low chuckle, the kind that carried years of experience, the kind of sound that told her he already knew why she was calling before she even had to say it. "Tell me what you need." Margaret glanced toward the window, her sharp eyes scanning the darkened street outside, watching for any sign of movement, for any hint that the bikers were already planning their next attack. "I need people. The kind who don't scare easy. The kind who remember how to fight." There was a pause, brief but heavy, and then the voice on the other end spoke again, this time softer, more serious. "You in trouble, Ironheart?" Margaret smirked, the nickname pulling at something deep in her memory, bringing back images of old battlefields, of men who had doubted her, of enemies who had learned too late that underestimating her was a fatal mistake. "Not yet, but I'm about to be." Another chuckle, then the sound of fingers drumming against a hard surface. "How many?" Margaret considered the question, knowing that asking for too little would be a mistake, but asking for too much would make it seem like she was doubting herself. Enough to make them rethink their choices. Enough to remind them who they're dealing with. There was another pause, followed by a slow, thoughtful exhale. "I'll send 6. That enough?" Margaret's grip on the phone tightened slightly, not because she was afraid, but because she knew what 6 men like the ones he was sending could do. They weren't just anyone. They were hers, men she had served with, trained with, fought alongside in places where law and order didn't exist, where survival had been their only mission. 6 men like that could turn a war in a matter of hours. "It'll do," she said finally. The voice on the other end hummed in agreement. "They'll be there by morning. You sure you don't want to tell me what you're up against?" Margaret smiled, but there was no humor in it, only steel. "I want them to be surprised." The man chuckled again, but this time there was an edge to it, something dark, something excited. "You really haven't changed." Margaret let the silence stretch between them, the weight of old memories pressing down like a familiar, well-worn coat. "No," she said quietly. "I haven't." The line clicked dead, and Margaret set the phone back into its cradle, her movements slow, deliberate, controlled. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet, feeling the air shift around her, knowing that in just a few hours, everything would change. The bikers thought they had won, thought they were in control, thought they could push her, terrorize her, make her disappear. They thought they had already won the war. They were wrong, because by the time the sun rose, they wouldn't be facing a scared old woman anymore. They would be facing soldiers, and soldiers never lost. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She had spent too many years on high alert, too many nights on battlefields where even closing her eyes for a few seconds could mean death. Instead, she sat in her chair by the window, listening to the sounds of the night, waiting. She could hear the town breathing, could feel the quiet before the storm, could sense the moment the balance of power would shift. Then, at precisely 5:47 a.m., she heard the first motorcycle. Not a group, not a gang, just one, then another, and another. By the time the sixth engine rumbled to a stop outside her house, Margaret was already standing on her porch, her hands resting on the wooden railing, watching as 6 men dismounted their bikes with the kind of practiced ease that came from years of experience. They were older now, just like her, but nothing about them had softened. Broad shoulders, steady hands, sharp, calculating eyes that scanned the area the second their boots hit the pavement. These weren't ordinary men. These were trained killers, men who had spent their lives learning how to dismantle a problem before it even became one. The tallest among them stepped forward first, his hair silver now, but his body still built like a human wrecking ball. "Damn, Ironheart," he said, eyeing her up and down. "You really do look like hell." Margaret smirked. "And you still look like you never learned how to duck." The others chuckled, low and knowing, the sound of old war dogs greeting each other after too many years apart. Then the tallest one folded his arms across his chest, his expression growing serious. "You want to tell us what kind of idiots we're about to deal with?" Margaret exhaled slowly, glancing down the street, toward the part of town where the bikers were likely still asleep, unaware that their time was up. "You'll meet them soon enough." The tallest man nodded, a slow, deliberate motion that spoke volumes. "Good." Then he cracked his knuckles. "Been a long time since I've had a good fight." Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that made men nervous, the kind of smile she had worn on battlefields where the enemy had never seen her coming. "Well," she said, turning toward the street, "you're about to get one." The morning air in Fairwood carried a strange kind of silence, the kind that sat heavy on the chest, thick with unspoken tension, a warning more than a peace. Margaret had seen mornings like this before, on the eve of battles when the ground itself seemed to know that something violent was coming, when the wind carried the weight of things about to change. She stood on her porch, one hand wrapped around her cane, the other clutching a cup of steaming black coffee, watching the town stir beneath the pale light of dawn, knowing full well that by sundown, the balance of power here would be decided. Behind her, the 6 men she had called in had settled in quietly, their presence like a coiled spring waiting to snap. They weren't the kind to waste words on unnecessary conversation, weren't the kind to posture or play at intimidation like the bikers did. No, these were men of action, soldiers forged in war, men who had bled and fought in places most people couldn't point to on a map, men who didn't flinch in the face of death because they had seen it too many times to be afraid anymore. They moved with practiced ease, inspecting the house, setting up a perimeter, checking the sight lines of every window and door without needing to be told. It was instinctual, ingrained into them like muscle memory, like breathing, and Margaret knew then, with absolute certainty, that she had made the right call. "You expecting trouble before lunch, or do we have time to eat first?" The tallest of them, a man called Reuben, stepped up beside her, arms crossed over his broad chest, his voice a low rumble that carried no urgency, just the mild curiosity of a man who had walked into situations far worse than this and had never once doubted the outcome. Margaret smirked, lifting her coffee cup slightly in response. "Eat fast." Reuben chuckled, nodding before turning back to the others, relaying something in a short, clipped tone that sent them moving with even more purpose. There was no panic among them, no tension, just readiness, a kind of quiet understanding that whatever happened next, they would handle it. Margaret's eyes drifted toward the street, where the town was beginning to wake. A few shopkeepers unlocked their doors, moving with the weary caution of people who had learned to live under a shadow, their eyes darting toward the stretch of road where the bikers had made their unofficial headquarters. The town had given up hoping for things to go back to normal. Margaret had seen the look in their eyes, the resignation of people who had decided that surviving was easier than fighting. And maybe, under different circumstances, she would have let them be. She would have told herself that it wasn't her problem anymore, that she had fought enough wars for people who wouldn't fight for themselves. But this wasn't just about the town anymore. This was about proving a point. She set her coffee down and stepped off the porch, her boots hitting the ground with a kind of certainty that didn't belong to an old woman. She didn't look back at the men behind her because she didn't need to. They would follow when it was time. Right now, she wanted to see them first, wanted to look them in the eyes one last time before she burned their world down. The walk to the bikers' headquarters was short, too short. It was a rundown bar on the edge of town, a place that had been abandoned for years until they took it over, transforming it into their makeshift base of operations. The sign out front was still missing half its letters. The windows were dark, the parking lot littered with bikes, and the smell of old beer and gasoline clung to the air like an oil slick. Margaret didn't hesitate. She stepped right up to the door and knocked hard, loud enough to make sure whoever was inside knew exactly who was on the other side. There was a moment of silence, then the unmistakable sound of footsteps. The door swung open, and there he was, the bearded leader, his face twisting into something halfway between amusement and irritation as he took in the sight of her standing there, unshaken, unfazed. "Lady," he said, rubbing the sleep from his eyes like he couldn't believe she had the audacity to show up at his door, "you got a death wish, or are you just stupid?" Margaret tilted her head slightly, a slow, deliberate movement, her expression unreadable. "Neither," she said evenly, her voice carrying just enough weight to make him shift slightly, as if his instincts were whispering that something was wrong. "But you might." The leader scoffed, stepping onto the porch, his posture radiating the kind of casual arrogance that only existed in men who had never faced true danger. "You really don't get it, do you?" He gestured behind him toward the bikes, toward the men who were already starting to stir, stretching, rubbing their eyes as they noticed her presence. "This is our town now." Margaret's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Not anymore." Before he could respond, the rumble of 6 motorcycles cut through the morning quiet. Not from the bar, not from his men, from behind Margaret. The sound was precise, controlled, the kind of discipline that came from real training. The bikers in the parking lot stood up, confused at first, their movements sluggish with sleep, but when they saw what was coming, their entire demeanor shifted. Their postures stiffened, their eyes narrowed, and for the first time since they arrived in Fairwood, they looked uncertain. The 6 riders pulled up beside Margaret, their movements synchronized, effortless. They didn't rev their engines, didn't call out threats, didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to make the bikers uneasy. The bearded leader's smirk flickered for just a second, barely noticeable, but Margaret caught it. "Down. What the hell is this?" he demanded, looking from Margaret to the men now flanking her. Margaret crossed her arms. "You said this was your town. I'm just introducing you to the people who are going to take it back." Reuben swung off his bike, stretching his neck with an almost lazy roll of his shoulders, but his eyes were sharp, locked on the men in front of him with the kind of quiet assessment that only came from killers sizing up a target. One of the younger bikers, a man who had probably never faced a real fight in his life, scoffed, trying to regain the bravado that had just been shaken loose. "You think a handful of old men are going to scare us off?" Reuben smirked, slow and dangerous. "No," he said casually. "But I think when your bones start breaking, you'll get the message." Silence. A thick, suffocating tension wrapped around the lot, stretching unbearably, until finally, the bearded leader took a slow step back. Margaret tilted her head. Smart choice. But she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. This was just the first move, the opening gambit, the moment before the real fight began. Because men like him didn't walk away just because they were outmatched. No, they dug in. And that was exactly what she was counting on. Because Margaret had been digging in her whole damn life. And now she was about to show them what it looked like when a soldier went to war. Margaret had never been the kind of person who spoke about the past. Not because she had forgotten it, not because it had faded into the background like an old, washed-out photograph, but because some things were meant to be carried in silence. She had lived through enough to know that war never truly left a person, that it sank deep into the bones, wove itself into the skin, shaped a person into something that could never quite fit into the world again. She had spent her entire life being careful with what she shared, letting people believe that she was just another veteran, just another name in the long list of soldiers who had served their country and then come home to live out the rest of their days in quiet. But Margaret had never been just another soldier. She had been something else entirely. The town had never known the truth, not even the people who had lived beside her for decades, not even the ones who had called her a friend. They knew she had served, knew she had done her time, but they had never asked for details, and she had never offered them. It was easier that way. Easier to let them assume she had worked a desk job, or served as a medic, or done something in logistics, something safe, something that fit the picture people liked to paint when they thought of women in the military. They never imagined the truth. They never imagined what she had really done. The bikers certainly didn't know. They had made the mistake of assuming she was weak, of thinking she was just an old woman with a sharp tongue and a stubborn streak, someone they could push around until she broke. But Margaret had spent years being trained to never break. She had been recruited straight out of college, chosen not just for her intelligence, but for the way she carried herself, the way she handled pressure, the way she could read a room and assess a situation before anyone else even realized something was wrong. She hadn't just been a soldier. She had been a specialist. Covert operations, black ops, missions that never made it into official reports, things that didn't exist on paper, things that no one talked about even in the highest levels of government. Margaret had been a problem solver, a fixer, a weapon designed to be used in places where diplomacy had failed and force was the only option left. She had operated in enemy territory long before women were ever officially acknowledged in combat roles. She had learned how to move unseen, how to fight with nothing but her bare hands, how to survive in places where survival wasn't guaranteed. She had taken down men twice her size, had walked through war zones where the only rule was to kill before you were killed, had faced monsters and come out the other side sharper, harder, more dangerous than anyone had ever expected. And then, one day, she had walked away. Not because she was tired, not because she had lost, but because she had seen too much, done too much, lost too much. She had come home, settled in Fairwood, built a quiet life for herself, hoping that maybe, just maybe, she could leave that part of herself behind. But now, as she stood in the middle of Main Street, flanked by the men she had once fought beside, facing down a gang of bikers who had no idea what they were dealing with, she realized something she had been avoiding for years. That part of her had never really left. It had just been waiting. Reuben, standing beside her, tilted his head slightly, watching the bikers with the kind of calm detachment that came from a lifetime of fighting. "They don't know who you are," he murmured, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. Margaret exhaled slowly, her grip tightening around her cane. "No," she said, "but they will." The bearded leader, still standing in the bar's doorway, still radiating that same cocky arrogance, let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head as he looked between Margaret and the 6 men who had arrived with her. "You think bringing in some old war buddies is going to change anything?" he asked, his tone laced with condescension, with the kind of bravado that only came from a man who had never been forced to prove himself against someone stronger. "Lady, I don't care what you did 50 years ago. This is our town now." Margaret tilted her head slightly, studying him. He was posturing, trying to keep control of the situation, but she could see the cracks forming, could see the way his shoulders were just a little too tense, the way his fingers twitched slightly at his sides, like a man who was starting to realize that he had made a mistake. "You ever kill a man?" she asked, her voice light, conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. The leader blinked, thrown off by the question. "What?" Margaret took a slow step forward, not aggressive, not threatening, just enough to make him focus on her, to make him feel the weight of the moment. "I asked," she said, "if you've ever killed a man. Not by accident. Not in a fight you didn't mean to start. I mean, looked a man in the eyes and decided to end his life." The leader scoffed, but the sound was forced. "What kind of question is that?" Margaret smiled, slow and sharp, a predator baring its teeth. The kind of question a real killer would answer without hesitation. The leader swallowed, his throat bobbing slightly, and there it was. The confirmation. Margaret had spent years looking into the eyes of killers, had spent her life surrounded by men who had done the unthinkable, and she knew that this man was not one of them. He was a bully, a thug, a man who liked power but didn't understand it, who liked to intimidate but had never actually been tested, who had spent his entire life taking from people who were too afraid to stop him. And Margaret was not afraid. She took another step forward, slow, deliberate, her voice dropping into something low, lethal, final. I have. Silence. The leader didn't move. The bikers behind him shifted uncomfortably. Reuben chuckled under his breath, shaking his head slightly. Oh, this is gonna be fun. Margaret didn't blink. You think you're dangerous because you ride a motorcycle and push people around. But let me tell you something, sweetheart. I have buried men in places no one will ever find. I have taken lives in ways that would keep you awake at night for the rest of yours. You think you've won? You think this is your town? She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to a whisper, just for him. You have no idea what you've started. The leader clenched his jaw. You're bluffing. Margaret smiled. Then, in one smooth motion, she pulled something from her pocket and tossed it at his feet. A small, unremarkable military patch, one that only a handful of people in the world would recognize. The bearded leader looked at it, his brow furrowing slightly. He didn't understand, but one of his men did. Margaret saw it the moment the younger biker's face went pale, the way his breath caught, the way he recognized the insignia for what it was. A mark of the kind of soldier that didn't officially exist. Margaret tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Still think this is your town? Margaret stood in the middle of Main Street, the weight of the morning sun pressing down on her shoulders, the pavement beneath her feet still damp from the overnight rain, the air thick with the scent of oil and exhaust. The bikers were still lingering outside their bar, their leader standing frozen in place, eyes locked onto the military patch she had just tossed at his feet, his jaw tight, his hands curled into fists, his bravado hanging by a thread. He didn't know what it meant, not really, but one of his men did, and Margaret could see it in the way the younger biker's expression had shifted from smug amusement to something dangerously close to fear. The kind of fear that came from recognizing something bigger, something deadlier than anything he had ever encountered before. That patch wasn't just fabric. It was a symbol, a warning, a message written in a language that only a select few could understand, a language that said you don't know who you're dealing with. She didn't speak, didn't move, didn't press the moment because she didn't need to. She had already planted the seed of doubt, and doubt was more corrosive than any direct threat, more effective than any show of force, because it worked from the inside, twisting into a man's mind and making him question everything he thought he knew. The bearded leader was already shifting on his feet, already replaying the last few weeks in his head, already wondering if maybe, just maybe, he had made a mistake. But Margaret knew men like him, knew that he wasn't the type to back down, not yet, not when his pride was on the line, not when he had spent so long believing himself to be untouchable. He would push forward because bullies didn't know how to retreat, and that was why she had called in reinforcements. She heard them before she saw them. The low, rumbling growl of approaching vehicles, heavy and deliberate, the sound slicing through the morning air like a knife through silk. It wasn't the erratic, aggressive roar of the bikers' motorcycles, the kind of sound meant to announce dominance and demand attention. This was different. This was controlled, measured, precise. This was the sound of men who weren't here to posture or threaten, men who had nothing to prove because they had already proven themselves in places where it mattered. Margaret didn't turn, didn't react, just watched as the bikers shifted, their heads snapping toward the noise, their bodies tensing as three large, blacked-out UVs rolled down the road and came to a smooth, calculated stop at the edge of the lot. The silence that followed was absolute, thick and heavy, the kind of silence that wrapped around a moment like a fuse leading to an inevitable explosion. Then the doors opened, and the real monsters stepped out. The first to emerge was a man Margaret hadn't seen in over 15 years, a man who had once been her right hand, her shadow, the kind of soldier who had never needed orders because he had always known exactly what needed to be done. He was taller than she remembered, broader, his body thick with muscle, his face marked by a long, jagged scar that stretched from his cheekbone down to his jawline, the kind of scar that told a story no one ever asked him to explain. His name was Cole Lancaster, but most people had stopped calling him by his real name years ago. Now they just called him Havoc. And for good reason. He stepped forward, his boots hitting the pavement with slow, deliberate precision, his sharp, dark eyes scanning the lot like he was assessing a battlefield, like he was calculating angles and distances and exits, like he was already working through a dozen different ways this could end, each one more violent than the last. He wasn't wearing a uniform, didn't need one, but the way he moved, the way he carried himself, the way he barely seemed to blink, it all told the same story. This was a man who had never stopped being a soldier. Behind him, the others emerged, 5 men just like him, each one different in appearance, different in build, but the same in presence, in the way they moved, in the way they took up space without trying, in the way their very existence radiated danger. They weren't just men. They were weapons. And Margaret had just pointed them at a target. The bearded leader took a step back. He caught himself quickly, tried to cover it up by squaring his shoulders, by tightening his grip on the beer bottle in his hand like it was something more than glass and liquid, but it was too late. The moment had already passed. The fear was already there. Havoc tilted his head slightly, his gaze locking onto Margaret, a slow, knowing smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Didn't think I'd ever see you call in a favor," he said, his voice a deep, gravelly thing, rough from years of shouting over gunfire, from breathing in sand and smoke and blood. "Must be bad." Margaret lifted an eyebrow. "You wouldn't be here if it wasn't." Havoc chuckled, low and dark, his gaze shifting to the bikers, lingering on the leader, assessing, calculating. "You the problem?" he asked casually, his voice laced with something sharp, something lethal. The bearded leader bristled, trying to find his footing again, trying to remind himself that he was the one in control. "I don't know who the hell you think you are, but—" Havoc moved. He didn't touch the man, didn't even get in his face, but he stepped forward, his presence alone enough to force the biker to instinctively take a step back, his body reacting before his brain even had time to process it. Havoc smiled. "That's what I thought." Margaret fought the urge to smirk. She had missed this. Missed the certainty, the way these men didn't waste time with unnecessary threats, the way they didn't posture or shout or try to intimidate with words. They didn't need to. They were the kind of men who walked into a room and changed the temperature just by existing. The bikers had spent weeks thinking they were in control, that they were the biggest threat in Fairwood, that no one would dare challenge them. But now, standing in the shadow of 6 men who had done things they couldn't even comprehend, they were starting to realize the truth. Margaret stepped forward, her voice calm, measured, unshaken. "You have one chance to walk away." She glanced down at the military patch still lying on the pavement between them, her lips curling into something sharp and knowing. "I'd take it." The bearded leader hesitated, his jaw tightening, his hands flexing at his sides. He didn't want to back down, not in front of his men, not in front of the town. But Margaret could see it, the realization settling into his bones, the understanding that he was outmatched, that he had never actually been in control. He had been playing at war. But Margaret had already won it. The leader clenched his jaw, took one last look at Havoc, then at Margaret, and finally turned on his heel, spitting onto the ground as he walked away, his men following close behind. Margaret didn't move, didn't call out after him, didn't tell him to stay gone. Because she knew. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. And she was going to finish it. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets of Fairwood, stretching over the cracked pavement like a warning of what was to come. Margaret stood at the edge of town, her cane resting against the worn wooden railing of her porch, her sharp eyes locked on the horizon where the last of the bikers had disappeared, knowing full well that they wouldn't stay gone for long. Men like them didn't know how to retreat, not truly. They were like dogs backed into a corner, too arrogant to recognize when they had already lost, too desperate to let go of the illusion that they were still in control. Margaret had seen it before, in war zones across the world, in the faces of men who had spent their whole lives believing themselves to be untouchable, only to come face to face with a force greater than they had ever imagined. The bikers hadn't just been defeated, they had been humbled, stripped of the false confidence they had been using to prop themselves up, forced to reckon with a truth they had never had to face before. They were not the biggest threat in the room, and now Margaret was going to make sure they never forgot it. She turned her head slightly, catching sight of Havoc as he leaned against one of the blacked-out SUVs, his arms folded across his chest, his sharp gaze following hers toward the empty road. The others were close by, their presence as unshakable as ever, a silent wall of experience and authority, men who had been through too much to be rattled by something as simple as a group of glorified street thugs. Havoc exhaled slowly, his lips twitching into something that might have been amusement if it weren't for the dark edge behind his eyes. "They'll be back," he said simply. Margaret nodded, fingers drumming against the wood beneath her hand. "Of course they will." Havoc tilted his head slightly, studying her the way he always had, like he was trying to see past the surface, past the decades that had separated them, past the wrinkles and the gray hair and the slow, deliberate movements that had replaced the razor-sharp reflexes she had once wielded like a blade. "And you're gonna let them?" Margaret smirked, slow and knowing. "For now." Havoc chuckled, shaking his head as he straightened, rolling his shoulders like a man getting ready for a fight he had been waiting a long time to have. Same old Ironheart. Margaret didn't correct him, didn't remind him that she wasn't that woman anymore, because deep down, she knew it was a lie. She had tried to leave that part of herself behind, had tried to build something quiet and peaceful in this town, had convinced herself that she had earned the right to live out the rest of her days in solitude. But war had a way of finding her, no matter how far she ran, and now that it had, she wasn't going to hide from it. She had already won the psychological battle. The bikers had seen what they were up against, had felt the shift in power, had understood on some primal level that they were no longer dealing with easy targets. But that wasn't enough. Fear was temporary. Respect was permanent. And if they were going to walk away from this town for good, if they were going to leave Fairwood and never look back, they needed to be taught a lesson that they would never forget. It was time to put them in their place. Margaret turned back toward Havoc, her expression hardening into something that sent a ripple of anticipation through the men around her, a shift in the air, a signal that something was about to happen. "They've had their warning," she said. "Now we show them what happens when they don't listen." Havoc's smirk widened, his fingers twitching at his sides like he was itching to move, itching to remind the world why people had once whispered his name with reverence and fear. "I was hoping you'd say that." Margaret glanced at the others, meeting each of their gazes in turn, watching as they nodded in silent agreement, as they accepted the unspoken command woven into the moment. Then, without another word, she turned and walked down the steps, her cane tapping against the ground as she led them toward the town, toward the bar where the bikers had gathered, toward the final act of this war. They reached the bar just after sunset, the neon lights flickering against the darkening sky, the distant hum of the jukebox inside barely audible over the muffled voices of the men within. The parking lot was full, lined with motorcycles that gleamed under the dull glow of the street lamp, a sea of chrome and steel belonging to men who had spent their whole lives believing that ownership was synonymous with strength, that the more space they took up, the more power they had. Margaret had spent her whole life proving men like that wrong. She didn't slow as she stepped onto the pavement, didn't hesitate as she walked straight through the lot, past the bikes, past the vehicles, past the men loitering outside who stiffened at the sight of her but didn't speak. Havoc and the others followed close behind, their movements easy, effortless, the kind of confidence that came from knowing that if things went sideways, they would be the ones walking away. Margaret could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them, the anticipation coiling like a wire about to snap, the inevitability of violence lingering just beneath the surface. She reached the door and kicked it open. Not gently, not cautiously, deliberately. The door slammed against the wall, the impact sending a shockwave through the room, cutting through the noise like a blade, turning every head in her direction in an instant. The bearded leader was at the bar, a bottle of whiskey clutched loosely in his hand, his expression twisting from amusement to something darker, something almost angry, but Margaret didn't give him time to react. She walked straight up to him, cane in hand, unwavering, unshaken, her voice carrying through the space like a command issued on a battlefield. "This is over." The leader scoffed, pushing off the counter, his bravado rekindling, his voice dripping with forced arrogance. "Says who?" Margaret didn't blink. "Says me." The leader let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head as he looked around at his men, gesturing toward her like she was some kind of joke, like she was just another old woman who didn't know when to quit. "You think you can just waltz in here and—" Margaret moved fast. Before he could finish his sentence, before he could even register what was happening, she swung her cane up in a sharp, practiced arc, the end of it slamming into his knee with bone-crunching force. The leader dropped. The sound he made was somewhere between a choke and a gasp, a raw, guttural noise of shock and agony, as he collapsed onto the floor, his whiskey bottle shattering beside him, his hands clawing at his leg like he could undo the damage, like he could stop the pain. The room erupted. Chairs scraped against the floor, men jumped to their feet, the air charged with the promise of retaliation, but Havoc and the others were already moving, stepping forward, closing in, their presence alone enough to keep the bikers frozen in place. Margaret didn't look at them. She crouched down beside the leader, watching as he struggled to breathe, as the realization settled into his bones, as the weight of his mistake crashed down on him like a hammer. "You were never in control," she said, her voice quiet, lethal. "Not of this town. Not of me." She leaned in closer, just enough for him to hear the final words she would ever say to him. "Leave." And this time he listened. The night was still settling over Fairwood when Margaret stepped out of the bar, her cane tapping against the cracked pavement, the scent of spilled whiskey and fear lingering in the air behind her. The world outside felt different now, as if something had shifted, as if the very fabric of the town had been rewritten in the span of a single violent moment. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, the change rippling through the streets like an aftershock, unsettling, undeniable, a confirmation of what had always been true but had never been spoken aloud. This was her town. She could hear the whispers before she saw them, the rustle of hushed conversations slipping through open windows, the hurried murmurs of shopkeepers who had already begun locking their doors, not out of fear of the bikers, but out of something else, something that had taken root the moment Margaret had walked into that bar and shattered the illusion that Fairwood belonged to anyone but her. The people of this town had always known her, or at least they had believed they had spent decades assuming she was just an old woman living out her days in quiet solitude, a relic of another time, harmless, ordinary, unremarkable. They had been wrong. She saw them now, the ones brave enough to watch from their porches, their faces half hidden in the glow of dim porch lights, their eyes wide with something that wasn't quite fear but wasn't far from it either. There was a hesitation in their movements, a new wariness in the way they regarded her, as if they were only now beginning to understand that Margaret Beaumont was not and had never been one of them. She had spent too many years keeping her history buried, too many years blending into the background, letting the town believe what it wanted to believe about her, allowing them to assume she was nothing more than a quiet, retired veteran who had left the past behind. But now the past was standing in front of them, unmistakable, unignorable. Havoc walked beside her, silent but watchful, his presence as heavy as the night air, his sharp gaze sweeping over the town with a kind of detached calculation that had made him a legend on battlefields far from here. The others followed at a slight distance, their movements measured, their postures at ease but ready, the kind of ease that came from knowing you were the most dangerous thing in any given room. They weren't here to make a scene, weren't here to gloat or threaten or revel in the victory they had just secured. They didn't need to. The message had already been sent, and the town had received it loud and clear. A door creaked open somewhere to her left, and Margaret turned her head slightly, her sharp eyes locking onto the source of the sound. It was Ruth Thompson, the owner of the diner, standing just inside the threshold of her doorway, fingers gripping the edge of the wooden frame like she wasn't sure whether she wanted to step outside or disappear back into the safety of her home. Her face was drawn tight with unease, but there was something else there too, something deeper, a question forming behind her tired eyes, a question Margaret could already hear before it was even spoken aloud. What are you? Ruth's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the quiet of the street, it might as well have been a shout. Margaret stopped walking. She turned fully toward the older woman, the weight of the moment pressing between them like an invisible wall. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed the truth to settle in the open air, unhidden, unapologetic. I'm the reason this town still exists. A sharp inhale, a flicker of recognition, the moment Ruth understood that this was not an exaggeration, not a boast, not some grand declaration meant to intimidate. It was a fact. The silence stretched between them, thick with things neither of them were willing to say, until Ruth nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, and stepped back inside, the door clicking shut behind her. Margaret exhaled, turning back toward the road, resuming her slow, steady walk toward home, aware that the rest of the town was still watching, still listening, still trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. She didn't need them to understand. She just needed them to remember. By morning, the town had changed again. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the way people carried themselves, the way shopkeepers stood a little straighter behind their counters, the way the morning routine unfolded with attention that hadn't been there before. The bikers hadn't returned, not yet, and the absence of their presence was almost more unsettling than their actual presence had been. Everyone was waiting. Margaret sat on her porch, coffee in hand, watching as life moved on, as Fairwood settled into a strange kind of uncertainty. She could feel it in the way people hesitated when they walked past her house, in the way their conversations quieted whenever she entered a room, in the way they looked at her with new eyes, eyes that saw something they hadn't been ready to see before. She had spent years being invisible, not because she had to be, but because it was easier that way. Easier to let them believe she was just another old woman. Easier to let them think she had left the war behind. Easier to pretend that she wasn't capable of doing exactly what she had done. But now the mask was gone, and the town was struggling to understand who exactly had been living among them all this time. Havoc leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed, his gaze sweeping over the street like he was waiting for something, like he was already anticipating the next move before it even had a chance to form. Margaret knew he was right to be cautious. The bikers weren't gone. Not yet. But they were bleeding. And wounded animals always came back. But you never thought you'd end up back in this kind of mess, huh? Havoc's voice was casual, but there was something in it, something that told her he had been thinking about this, about why she had called him, why she had reached out after all these years. Margaret took a slow sip of her coffee, staring out at the street. I tried to let it go. Havoc chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah? And how did that work out for you? Margaret didn't answer because they both already knew. She had tried. She had built a life for herself here, had carved out a space in this town where she could pretend, for a little while, that she was just a woman living out the last stretch of her life in peace. But the world didn't let people like her disappear. It found them, no matter where they ran, no matter how well they hid, no matter how much they tried to bury the past under quiet routines and long, empty days. She had thought she was done fighting. She had been wrong. And now the whole town knew it too. By noon, the first shopkeeper had come to her. Then another. Then another. Not with fear. Not with hesitation. But with respect. It was the beginning of something new. Something different, something that had never existed in Fairwood before. For the first time, the town wasn't looking at her like a relic of the past. They were looking at her like a shield, a leader, a force they could stand behind. And Margaret was ready, because the war wasn't over. Not yet. The town had settled into an uneasy rhythm, the kind of quiet that wasn't really peace, but rather the deep, tense silence of something unfinished, something unresolved, the calm that always came before the final clash. Margaret had felt it before, had lived in it, had breathed it in places far worse than Fairwood. In cities where the streets ran red and silence wasn't a sign of safety but a prelude to chaos. She sat on her porch as she always did, her cane resting against the armrest, her sharp eyes scanning the road, watching the way the people of Fairwood moved through their day with cautious steps, their eyes still carrying the weight of the past few days. They had seen the power shift, had watched the bikers lose their grip, had begun to recognize that the woman they had lived beside for decades was not what they had believed her to be. But there was something else now, something she hadn't seen in a long time: trust. The shopkeepers who had once looked at her with polite disinterest now met her gaze with something steadier, something closer to respect. The old men who used to tip their hats at her in passing now nodded instead, an acknowledgement of something deeper, something unspoken but understood. But respect wasn't enough to end a war. The bikers hadn't left. Not really. Their presence had faded into the shadows, retreating into dark corners of the town like wounded predators licking their wounds, waiting, planning. Margaret knew better than to believe they would cut their losses and walk away. Knew that men like them didn't accept defeat without trying to claw back one last piece of control. She had seen it too many times before. Arrogance turned to desperation. Desperation turned to recklessness. Recklessness turned to a fatal mistake. She didn't have to wait long. It was just past 11 o'clock when she heard the first sound of approaching motorcycles, the deep guttural growl of engines slicing through the quiet, tearing across the empty streets like a storm rolling in. They weren't trying to be subtle this time. They wanted to be heard, wanted to announce their presence, wanted to make sure she knew they were coming. Margaret set down her coffee, exhaling slowly as she reached for her cane, rising from her chair with the kind of slow, deliberate patience that had once driven her commanding officers insane. She had never been one to rush into a fight. She let the fight come to her. The first bike roared past her house, followed by another, then another, until half a dozen of them were circling the street, their tires skidding against the pavement, their riders turning their heads toward her as they passed, their eyes burning with something that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't far from it either. She recognized most of them, faces she had seen before, men who had stood beside their leader when he had tried to claim this town, men who had laughed when she had first refused to back down, men who had once believed themselves untouchable. Now they were desperate. She could see it in their movements, in the way they lingered just a little too long, in the way their shoulders were too stiff, their grips too tight on the handlebars. They weren't just here to intimidate. They were here to finish this. The lead bike skidded to a stop in front of her house, the others following close behind, the engines still rumbling beneath them, filling the air with the acrid scent of gasoline and burning rubber. The bearded leader was gone. She had made sure of that. But the man who stepped off the lead bike now was younger, meaner, a second in command who had been waiting for his chance to take charge, a man with too much to prove and not enough sense to realize when he was already dead. He took a step forward, pulling off his helmet, his lips curling into something that might have passed for a smirk if it weren't for the barely concealed frustration in his eyes. "You think you've won," he said, his voice loud enough to carry across the street, loud enough to reach the ears of the people watching from their windows, the ones who had stopped pretending not to notice, the ones who had been waiting to see what would happen next. Margaret tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Haven't I?" The younger man's smirk twitched, his fingers flexing at his sides. "You don't get it, lady. This ain't over. You might have scared some of the boys off, might have played your little games, but you don't get to just walk away from this." Margaret exhaled slowly, her gaze unwavering. "I wasn't planning on walking away." Something flickered in his eyes, something uncertain, something he didn't quite understand. He had expected her to be afraid. He had expected her to back down. He had expected something that was never going to happen. "You think you can stop us?" he asked, his voice a little sharper now, a little more desperate. Margaret smiled. "I don't need to." And then, from the alleyways, from the side streets, from the hidden corners of Fairwood, they stepped forward. Not Havoc. Not the men she had called in. Not the soldiers she had fought beside. But the people of Fairwood. Shopkeepers. Farmers. The old men who had once sat on their porches and watched the world pass them by. The young men who had spent their whole lives avoiding fights they thought they couldn't win. The people who had once believed this town wasn't theirs anymore, who had spent weeks bowing their heads, turning their backs, whispering about the day the bikers would finally take full control. They weren't hiding anymore. They stood in doorways, in storefronts, on sidewalks, their faces hard, their bodies steady, their presence unshaken. The younger biker hesitated. Margaret didn't. "You came here thinking you owned this place," she said, her voice calm, level, carrying across the street like a judge delivering a final verdict. "You thought fear was the same as power. You thought silence meant surrender." She took a slow step forward, her cane tapping against the pavement, her sharp eyes locking onto his. "But the thing about fear is that it doesn't last. And now," she gestured toward the people behind her, toward the ones who had once believed they were alone, the ones who had finally remembered what it meant to stand together. "Now you have nothing left." The younger man's fingers tensed at his sides, his body coiling like a spring, like a man trying to decide whether to fight or run, whether to throw one last desperate punch or accept that the battle was already over. Havoc, standing beside her, exhaled slowly. "If you make the wrong choice right now," he said, his voice as casual as if he were discussing the weather, "you won't get another one." The younger man's jaw clenched. His shoulders stiffened. And then, slowly, deliberately, he stepped back. Then another step. Then another. Then he turned, climbed onto his bike, and gunned the engine. The others followed. Margaret stood still as they disappeared down the road, their figures swallowed by the distance, their presence fading into nothing, leaving behind a town that was no longer afraid. Havoc let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "Damn, Ironheart. You really do know how to end a war." Margaret smirked, watching the town settle, watching the people step forward instead of back, watching the world shift into something stronger, something unchangeable. "No," she murmured. "I just know how to win one." The dust hadn't even fully settled on the cracked pavement before the town of Fairwood began to breathe again, slow and hesitant at first, like a body waking from a deep slumber, testing its limbs, feeling out the space it had reclaimed. The bikers were gone, the sound of their engines fading into the distance, swallowed by the winding roads that led out of town, but the echoes of what had happened still lingered in the air, thick and heavy, as if the very bones of Fairwood needed time to understand that it was safe again. Margaret stood where she had always stood, on the front lines, unflinching, unshaken, watching as the people around her adjusted to their newfound freedom. They moved differently now, shoulders no longer hunched, eyes no longer darting to dark corners in search of unseen threats, steps no longer careful and subdued. The shift was subtle but undeniable, a ripple of something deeper, something that had been taken from them and now, at last, had been returned. But Margaret knew that battles weren't just fought on the streets, and wars didn't just end when the enemy retreated. Something inside of her had changed, something she wasn't sure she could ever get back. She had spent years believing she had finally left the fight behind, that the war was something she could bury beneath quiet days and peaceful nights, beneath morning coffee and walks through town, beneath the polite nods of shopkeepers and the predictable comfort of a place where nothing ever really happened. She had told herself she had earned that peace, that she had given enough of herself to a world that had taken too much. But now, as she stood in the wake of everything that had unfolded, she wasn't so sure anymore. She could still feel it thrumming beneath her skin, that old, familiar electricity, the rush of battle, the sharp clarity that came when the stakes were high and the world narrowed to nothing but the next move, the next breath, the next heartbeat. She had spent decades training herself to see every angle, every possible attack, every exit, every advantage, and she had thought, hoped, that part of her had finally quieted. It hadn't. And that realization settled into her bones like a weight she wasn't sure she was ready to carry again. Havoc watched her from where he stood by the curb, arms folded across his chest, his sharp gaze missing nothing, his presence steady, familiar, a reminder of a past she had once believed was behind her. The others were nearby, lingering at the edges of the moment, their job done, their presence still heavy, their bodies still carrying the ease of men who had spent their entire lives preparing for a fight that never really ended. They weren't just soldiers. They were like her. And maybe that was the problem. Maybe Margaret had spent so long pretending to be something else that she had forgotten who she really was, had convinced herself that she could simply stop being the thing she had been made into, that she could erase the years spent on battlefields most people would never know existed, that she could ignore the instincts that had been trained into her so deeply they had become a part of her DNA. But war had a way of calling people back. And Margaret had answered. "You're quiet." Havoc's voice was low, unreadable, his expression giving away nothing, but Margaret had known him too long not to hear the meaning behind the words. She exhaled, slow and steady, feeling the weight of the cane in her hand, the familiar ache in her joints, the years that had settled into her body even as her mind remained as sharp as ever. "I thought it would feel different." Havoc raised an eyebrow. "Thought what would feel different?" Margaret gestured vaguely at the street, at the people, at the town that was beginning to return to itself, at the world that had been forced to bend and was now slowly straightening again. "Winning." A slow smirk tugged at the corner of Havoc's mouth, but there was something else there too. Something deeper, something closer to understanding. "That's because it's never really over." Margaret knew that. She had always known that. But she had wanted to believe that maybe this time things would be different, that maybe this time she could step back and let the world move on without her, that maybe this time she could finally be done. But war didn't end just because you walked away. And Margaret was beginning to wonder if she would ever be able to walk away at all. She turned her gaze back toward the people of Fairwood, toward the ones who were still watching her, still trying to reconcile the woman they had always known with the woman they had seen in the past few days. They had always thought of her as Margaret Beaumont, the quiet old woman who lived on the edge of town, the woman who kept to herself, the woman who had once served but had long since retired from anything that mattered. Now they were seeing the truth. Now they were seeing who she really was. And Margaret wasn't sure what to do with that. They'll be talking about this for a long time. Havoc's voice was light, but his eyes were sharp, watching her, waiting for something, maybe an answer, maybe an acknowledgement of something she wasn't quite ready to say. Margaret exhaled, rolling her shoulders slightly, the ache settling deeper, a reminder that she wasn't young anymore, that her body was no longer the weapon it had once been, that time had done what war never could, worn her down. "Let them talk." Havoc chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't think they'll ever stop." And maybe that was the real ending. Not the fight, not the victory, not the retreat of the enemy or the reclaiming of the town, but the knowledge that Margaret Beaumont was no longer a mystery, that the town knew her now, that there was no more hiding. And maybe deep down, she had never really wanted to hide it all. That night, Margaret sat alone on her porch, the world quiet around her, the sky painted in deep blues and purples, the first stars beginning to flicker into existence. The street was still peaceful, a stark contrast to the battle that had played out not long ago, a reminder that even after war, life continued, that the world kept spinning, that people moved on even when scars remained. She sipped her coffee, the warmth spreading through her, grounding her, anchoring her to the moment, to the now. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Not the town, not the people. Her. She had spent so long trying to be something she wasn't, trying to fit into a life that had never truly belonged to her, trying to convince herself that she could be normal. But normal had never been an option. Not for her. And maybe finally she was ready to accept that. Havoc stepped onto the porch, leaning against the railing, his presence a familiar weight beside her. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching the stars, waiting. Then finally, after a long silence, "So what now?" Margaret exhaled, closing her eyes for a brief moment before opening them again, staring out at the town, at the world she had fought to protect, at the life she had spent so many years trying to build. And then she smiled. Because for the first time in a long time, she knew the answer. We wait. For what? For whatever came next. Because there was always another battle. And Margaret Beaumont would always be ready. The morning came slow, golden light spilling over the rooftops, stretching across the quiet streets, wrapping around Fairwood like a silent promise of peace. The town had changed overnight, not in a way that outsiders would notice, not in a way that left visible marks on storefronts or sidewalks, but in a way people carried themselves, in the way fear had loosened its grip, in the way shoulders were squared instead of slumped, in the way heads were held high instead of bowed. The war had ended, not with a final battle, not with blood spilled on the pavement, but with something far rarer, something Margaret had seen only a few times in her long life, a town reclaiming itself. She watched it unfold from her porch, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, steam curling into the crisp morning air, her sharp eyes scanning the world that had, for so long, existed in the periphery of her life. She had always been here, but she had never truly been part of it. The people of Fairwood had known her name, had spoken to her in passing, had welcomed her into their community in the way small towns did, but they had never really seen her. Not until now. And now that they had, she wondered if things would ever go back to the way they were. She wasn't sure she wanted them to. Havoc sat beside her, one boot resting on the porch railing, a cigarette dangling from his fingers, his body carrying the easy tension of a man who had spent his entire life waiting for the next fight, the next war, the next moment when everything would change again. He had stayed longer than she expected, longer than any of them had, his presence a quiet reminder that the past never really let go, that the people who had been forged in fire always found their way back to one another, even when they tried to walk separate paths. He exhaled slowly, watching the smoke curl into the air before speaking. "You ever think about leaving?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She had lived in Fairwood for more than 20 years, had built a life here, had carved out something stable, something predictable, something that had felt like a kind of peace. But it had never truly been home, not in the way that mattered. It had been a place where she could exist without question, where she could fade into the background, where no one had asked too much of her, where she had been allowed to pretend she was someone she wasn't. But now the pretending was over. She took a slow sip of her coffee, savoring the warmth, the simplicity of it, the way it grounded her in a moment that felt heavier than it should have. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "Maybe." Havoc made a low sound in his throat, something that might have been amusement but wasn't quite, something that spoke of understanding, of recognition, of the same feeling that had settled in his own bones. "Wouldn't blame you." Margaret exhaled through her nose, a quiet breath, thoughtful, measured. "Wouldn't blame myself either." The town didn't need her anymore. That was the truth of it. The people of Fairwood had seen what they were capable of, had stood together, had learned how to hold their own ground, had discovered that they were stronger than they had ever believed. And that was good. That was what she had wanted. But where did that leave her? For years, she had convinced herself that this was what she had been working toward, that this town, this life, this quiet existence was what she had always wanted, that she could let herself grow old here, that she could fade into the background, that she could finally rest. But some people weren't meant for quiet endings. Some people weren't meant to stay in one place. Some people weren't meant to let go of the fire that had kept them alive for so long. She turned her gaze toward the horizon, toward the open road, toward the places she had left behind, the places she had never been, the places she had avoided for fear that they would remind her too much of who she was. Maybe it was time to stop avoiding them. Maybe it was time to stop pretending. Havoc took another slow drag from his cigarette, exhaling through his nose, watching her out of the corner of his eye. "If you do leave, where would you go?" Margaret tilted her head slightly, considering. "Somewhere new. Somewhere quiet." She smirked. "At least for a while." Havoc chuckled, shaking his head. "You're not the quiet type, Ironheart." She smiled, the kind of smile that carried years of knowledge, of experience, of a truth she had spent too long trying to ignore. "No," she agreed. "I guess I never was." They sat in silence for a long moment, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled, the kind that came easy between people who had nothing left to prove to each other, the kind that settled deep in the bones, familiar and steady. Then, finally, Havoc stretched his arms over his head, letting out a slow, satisfied breath. "Well, whatever you decide, you don't have to do it alone." Margaret glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "You offering to follow me around?" Havoc smirked. "I'm saying if you ever get tired of the whole small-town legend thing, there's always another fight somewhere." Margaret exhaled slowly, turning her gaze back to the horizon, the road stretching out before her, endless and open, filled with possibilities she hadn't let herself consider in a long time. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe this was just the next chapter. She set down her coffee, stood from her chair, and stretched out the stiffness in her joints, the aches and pains that had come with time, the reminders that she was older now, but not done. Never done. The town had its peace. It was time for her to find hers. She reached for her cane, gripping it tight, feeling the weight of it, feeling the strength in her fingers, in her body, in the life she had carved for herself with blood and bone and sheer, unrelenting will. Then, with one last look at the town she had called home, Margaret turned toward the road. By the time the sun had fully risen, Fairwood had already begun moving forward. The world didn't stop for war, didn't pause for victories, didn't hold its breath for the people who had fought to make it safe. Life continued. The town continued. And so would Margaret. The whispers would remain, the stories would be told. The legend of the 86-year-old woman who had stood her ground against an entire gang will become something more than history, something woven into the very foundation of Fairwood itself. But Margaret, she had other places to be. She had other battles to fight. Not because she had to, but because some people were never meant to stand still. She took one last look over her shoulder at the town, at the people, at the life she had built here. Then she nodded once, just to herself, and she walked away. Margaret Beaumont had spent her life fighting battles most people would never know existed. She had given everything she had to wars that had never been hers to win, had walked through fire, had been forged in it, had come out the other side sharper, harder, stronger. And now she was walking into the unknown again. Not as an old woman, not as a retired soldier, but as who she had always been. A fighter, a warrior, a legend. And her war wasn't over yet.